Hi, I'm Dan Kubisky, Chair of the International Community at the Society of Professional Journalists. 140 countries have versions of freedom of information laws. Unfortunately, these laws do not apply to international organizations such as the United Nations, the World Bank, or the World Health Organization. And yet, these organizations can have as dramatic impact on the country's society, economy, or politics as any domestic entity that is subject to the local FOIA laws. Back in as the 20th century was closing, and yes, that does make us sound a little old, Toby McIntosh began to focus on this issue. By 2005, he had founded the Global Transparency Initiative that worked with other civic organizations to lobby the international financial institutions for more access to their material. He has continued working for increased transparency from international institutions. And now there is Eye on Global Transparency. And I'll put the URL for that in the comments section. I should also mention that Toby was my editor back at the turn of the century when I was reporting from Hong Kong for the then Bureau of National Affairs, which is now part of the Bloomberg media family. Toby, thank you very much for taking time to talk about Eye on Global Transparency. And I know I gave a rather quick introduction to your work on behalf of freedom of information laws. Is there anything you'd like to add and to maybe fill out a little bit?
Sure. Well, Eye on Global Transparency is my niche blog in which I try to follow international organizations. And as you say, some of them have access to information policies of their own. So I try to follow what they do. The impact they have, as you also mentioned, they have terrific impact on their projects. They have billions to spend, and the concerns about their transparency dates back a long way, and they have improved in a lot of ways in providing proactive information about what they do, but their policies on access to information, the kinds of things that you can request, are still pretty secretive. So what I try to focus on is what they're doing on different kinds of transparency, and particularly what happens if you submit a request and try to ask for some information about one of their programs or how they spend their money or how their programs are going. So this is a very niche kind of area, but access to information can make a difference, particularly for people in countries who are affected by the international organizations, particularly the development banks. So I file my own requests sometimes to test their policies, and I sometimes sort of shift a little bit into a slightly activist role by talking and working with civil society organizations who are monitoring changes that have been proposed to the policies, and sort of assist them a little bit. And I sometimes assist journalists in making requests to the international organizations.
Okay. You talked about sometimes it's kind of difficult to get information from these groups. Uh, they are not covered by the local freedom of information laws, and they seem to be kind of relish that role in some ways. Why do you think that they're just so unwilling to share information about their projects and their programs?
Well, I think the motivations are the usual ones of just not wanting scrutiny about what they do in any kind of detail. I've just recently wrote about a rather odd case in which the International Organization for Migration was asked for reports that it provided to the Greek government about a program that it funded to help immigrants return to their home countries. So these were the reports about how well this program was working. And a journalist asked for copies of these reports, and the Greek government consulted with the IMO, and or so the IOM, And the IOM said, well, we have UN immunity. We don't have to respond to anything under your FOIA law. We are exempt from your FOIA law. And the International Organization for Migration has no access policy of its own. So these reporters were completely stymied. There's no way they can get the information, even though the reports were sent to their own government, and they can't ask the international organization for the information. So, what's their motivation? I guess less scrutiny on just how well they're doing with this effort to send people back. I'm not criticizing the effort. It's an interesting program to help immigrants return to their home countries. And so they are just avoiding an effort to look at why this program's not working, and some of the details about how it works. So it's this kind of thing happens at lots of organizations. Particularly, they will write about their programs, and some of these organizations are fabulous in writing about what they're doing, but they're particularly reluctant to provide information about how well the programs are doing. So it's another example. I asked for, after COVID, I was interested in what audit contracts have been signed with World Bank money to figure out what had happened to the money, lots of money that the World Bank was sending to, in this case, Sierra Leone. I just picked it out of a hat to test it. And the World Bank said, no, you can't have the contract that was let to a company, an audit company, at 3 times the expected amount. And then a couple of years later, I said, well, how about the audit? Can I have the audit? No, you can't. So, those are things where I think it's pretty clear why you would want to see, there's a monetary impact. Did the money get spent well? What was it really spent on? So some of these things obviously are, and as with most FOIA work, your reporting is doing something later to find out what happened. With FOIA stuff, you can't really expect to get daily headlines. You're looking backwards for the most part to try to figure out what happened, which is really important, I think. But clearly, it's hard to do this with some of these international organizations. And there are successes. People do file requests and get answers. But when it comes to some of the more difficult or controversial things, they keep a pretty closed door on things.
Yeah, yeah.
And sometimes they'll change their minds. Like I was interested in a program that the UN Environment Program does on methane, monitoring methane, but with satellites. So they created this enormous system of monitoring satellite emissions, or monitor methane emissions by satellite. And then they were going to tell the countries what emissions they saw. So they wrote to the countries and said, here are emissions we've noticed. And they did release the database of the emissions, but they didn't release the notices to the countries. So I asked for the letters they sent to the countries. And first of all, they said, okay, here's one. I asked for one about Kazakhstan, where there was a big emission event. And they said, okay, here's what we sent. And then I followed up by asking for 15 letters sent to Kazakhstan. And they said, oh no, we can't give you them anymore. And they changed their rationale. They can be very clever. They said, oh, that's not environmental information. So, people can't get those letters that were sent about the methane emissions.
Wow. Wow. Oh, you mentioned that sometimes you work with civil groups. In the US, most of the freedom of information requests do not come from journalists. They come from community organizations, they come from business groups. Are you seeing growing support for the journalism community or outside the journalism community in your efforts to bring transparency to these international organizations? And if so, what kind of coalitions have you built?
Well, it is true, as you say, that business groups business corporations are the major requesters of information, and some of those are pretty routine requests. Civil society groups and journalists, as they are in the United States, submit a small fraction of the requests. In terms of pushing for more transparency, it's the civil society groups and journalism groups carrying the burden there. And businesses rarely get involved, and I'm not sure I could entirely explain it, except they may not be as interested in quite the same things. Right now, there's the International Financial Corporation, the private sector lending arm of the World Bank, is reviewing its policy, and there's a coalition of civil society groups that's trying to make sure that they rewrite their policy in a better way. And we'll see how that goes. These can be sort of long processes. I helped with a group that tried to combine civil society groups over several years to lobby on access to information at the UN organizations, at the IFIs. And I have to say, I think we were somewhat successful, but the funding for that ran out, and we don't have an organized coalition like that, but spontaneous coalitions spring up when the international organizations do their periodic reviews. So civil society organizations are the primary drivers of change in this area.
Okay. We were talking about this before we started the interview, that in Washington and New York, you have a lot of international organizations, and if they're not headquartered there, they've got a significant branch office.
Mm-hmm.
And I was just wondering, for us, and especially for those of us in the specialty press, getting information from these international groups is important because it's part of our story, part of our niche market reporting, or it could be. What about elsewhere in the US? Do you see where reporters might have an interest in this battle to get more transparency in the international bodies? Or is this something more dealing with the developing world and those of us in the niche reporting markets?
Well, I think there clearly is a need for the press in general to pay more attention to international organizations, particularly on the climate change side. There's just not enough attention paid to some of these specialized discussions that are going on around climate change. And so all I could do is say that I think that's worth more attention. Whether it's not always easy to cover some of these bodies, particularly the negotiations over climate change matters go on for years, and it's a very slow process to follow them, and sometimes it's rather opaque. There have been some positive things that have happened. The International Maritime Organization has substantially improved what's available about what's being discussed at meetings, and they were the last organization among the UN agencies to adopt a freedom of information policy, so you can make requests. Only about half of the major UN organizations have access to information policies, but the sister organization, the International Civil Aviation Organization, has no access to information policy and is generally quite opaque about what's going on at its meetings. So reporters who want to follow what's going on there have a much tougher time. That said, the topics that are being discussed are pretty important. The IMO, the Maritime Organization, has been grappling with what kinds of fuel ships should be using, and how to regulate that, how to tax it, how to reduce their impact on climate change through their emissions. A long-running discussion, and anybody who is following shipping industry has been following it quite closely. So for U.S. reporters, there are potential stories there, I think. But I think you have to be prepared to learn a lot about what these organizations do, because they can be they can be complex, and also it's a long process usually before they get to conclusions. So a lot of the attention on these organizations, excuse me, is at in the developing world. And there, of course, a country where a major program is going to affect them, the reporters are usually all over that. So when an IMF delegation comes to your country, reporters will crowd the room to cover it. So I sometimes cover kind of some related transparency topics, like I've been interested in debt transparency around international debt owed by developing countries. And the IMF and the World Bank could have an impact on what sort of disclosures are made about that debt. So recently in Senegal, they discovered there was $3 billion in debt that hadn't been disclosed. It's created a major crisis. And so this hidden debt raises questions about, well, what could have been done to prevent that from happening? So I like to try to write about those kinds of things and what policies could change around that. There's been another area that I've followed, which actually it's rather obscure, but it could have a big impact on how much private capital is spent in developing countries. And it has to do with the access to a database, ironically called GEMS, which is kept by the World Bank and the other major IFIs. And there actually has been some improvement over time, because there's been pressure by the private sector. And this is the kind of an example of where the private sector does get involved. They had a direct interest in having the information that was in this database, which described the risk of lending to these countries. It was the accumulated wisdom of the World Bank and other organizations about the risk of lending. So obviously the private sector was interested in that, and they did start to pressure the World Bank and others to open it up, and with some success, and not complete, but I was interested in how the decisions were being made, and I asked for the minutes of the meeting of the group that controls this database, which is run by the European Investment Bank. And they delayed for more than 2 years in giving me an answer.
Wow.
Then I've appealed that to the European Union Ombudsman. That I don't have a decision from them on that, but I mean, these things get fairly complex, and they drag out, and then I won't bore you with all the details, but I don't know how much I'll eventually get out of the European Investment Bank about the management of this database. But still, it's an important thing, and it could substantially increase the amount of money that's lent by the private sector to the developing and emerging markets. So these are sort of large picture issues, I guess, and yet they're all about decisions on transparency.
Yeah. Well, this is, and your multi-year effort to get this information brings me to this question of what kind of success have you had in making these organizations just a little bit more transparent? I mean, you mentioned about half of the UN agencies now at least have a policy for freedom of information. Are they following up on that policy in a positive way, or is it just so much ink on paper?
Well, there are successes in making requests, and I certainly always encourage people to make requests. the example of the pressure on the to get the GEMS database is an indication that the organizations will start to release more information under certain conditions. Some of the routine materials that I think are important are still sometimes very hard to get. I thought I had a success with the World Bank when I made a request regarding Tanzania for information, and I had to make an appeal to the appeals board at the World Bank, which is a group of outside experts. And they kind of just sided with me, and they said, "Well, certain of these documents have to be released." And I got some of them, and then I asked for some other documents relating to some other countries in Africa. This same category of document called aid memoirs, and now they're delaying giving me an answer. And I wrote an article about a memo that they released about their access policies, which suggests that they might completely refuse to give access to these aid memoirs. So they're subtly shifting their policy. But these are very important documents because they tell you how well a project is being implemented. So I suspect we're going to learn in the end that they're going to deny access to these documents, and maybe someday we'll get around to trying to change their whole policy so that they don't take that position. I have to say that successes are kind of few and far between. So sometimes I wonder, well, what keeps me going on this? But I think the testing of them eventually will have some good impact, just as it does when people file FOIA requests in the United States. You don't always get what you want, but you learn where the sensitive areas are and where their policies, what their policies don't cover, and that's also important. Sometimes the things that I come up with are just like the UN Environment Program. They won't release the names of the people who are on the appeals panel. At UNESCO the other day, they just turned down a request of mine. I asked for the decision made by its appeals panel. They said, "No, we can't release the decision." It'd be like a court saying we're not going to issue its rulings. So I've appealed that, so on it goes.
Wow. The struggle for freedom of information, journalists have always been in the forefront of this battle, whether it's the United States or it's, other parts of the world. This is something that, again, you mentioned that maybe somebody in Boise may not be as interested in as somebody from New York or Washington. But are there things that local journalism groups or the journalism community in general can do to help you in this effort to make these international bodies more transparent?
Well, I certainly think so. The civil society organizations that are involved in these efforts are usually ones that are working on, say, development policy or climate change. And you make a very good point, and they should do more to reach out to groups like yours that could put in their 2 cents. A lot of this is done by sending letters and trying to influence country delegates and the big organizations. So the more people who raise their voices about these kinds of issues of lack of transparency at international organizations, the better. And I should probably do a better job of trying to make it more relevant to groups and reporter groups. But there are certainly reporters out there using these policies. At the European Investment Bank, I'm helping a reporter who's trying to get some very important documents, their own evaluations of whether they're following their own best banking practices. You would think that would be an obvious thing for them to release, but they've completely refused her requests. So we're appealing that. We're going to go to the we already are appealing to the European Union Ombudsman. So, she's out there trying to fight for some important financial information out of this bank. So there are great examples of why journalists should be actively trying to get this information. It's sometimes frustrating because the banks don't disclose who asked for information, so it's hard to build a community of
Mm,
requesters uh, for a particular organization and say, oh well, these are the reporters who tried to get it and can't get it. That's a bit of a goal of mine at some point is try to do that, but I will certainly try to include you at points where your voice could be helpful because I think it could be helpful, and give some more thought to how to involve journalists because it's always been important in the U.S. for journalists to raise their voices about FOIA reform, and
right.
there's just not the same kind of constituency for transparency at the international organizations, and the more we can try to create it, the better. They are, I find, remarkably sensitive when you stick a pin in them, and so that's part of what keeps me going is that they are sometimes willing to make changes, and sometimes unwilling, but at least you've identified where the problems are.
Right, right. We've gone on, I think, a little longer than I had promised that we would for this discussion. Uh, so, what I'd like to just offer you right now is there anything that we haven't talked about yet that you would like to be sure to raise, an issue, a particular point, before we close out this conversation?
Um, well, I guess when we talked about the need to cover these organizations, I think that's something that I would really like to see more people do. The There's just not a lot of attention to some of these organizations for some of the reasons I discussed earlier, the complication of the policies and this slow process that's involved. But these are some of the biggest um, issues of our time, particularly related to climate change, that do have transparency elements. And um, unfortunately, if you try to follow some of these organizations, you'll run into some of this. Even covering meetings is sometimes difficult. They but people who covered meetings at the International Maritime Organization eventually got them to change their policies and open up a little bit more. So, um, look for opportunities to cover these organizations because they do have an impact on either your country directly if you're a recipient of aid, or in our country the enormous impact of what's done or not done on climate change. What are they doing on providing funding for adaptation in other countries, or what kinds of, as I mentioned, the International Maritime Organization, adopting policies that are going to impact U.S. industries, the airline industry is the same way. They're going to be impacted by international policies. So we have to watch these things, and potentially they could uh, significantly change what happens on climate change. So um, there are opportunities for reporting there, and also weaknesses in transparency that you'll discover if you start to report on them. And I'm always eager to hear from reporters who get into this stuff and realize there are problems and want to work on or draw attention to these transparency problems. And I can help with that, help with appeals, help with requests. Always happy to chip in on that sort of thing.
I fully agree that we really need to have more coverage of some of these
Mhm.
international organizations, because, as I said at the beginning, their impact on societies and economies around the world is really quite large,
Mhm.
and it would be nice to have an eye on them. and an independent eye from journalists.
Mhm.
So, Toby McIntosh, founder of Eye on Global Transparency, thank you very much for your time. I look forward to staying in touch with you and reporting on your progress in our international community newsletter. And I'm going to use that as a plug for our publication. The international community does put out a weekly newsletter, tidbits, news articles about press freedom, journalist safety, reporting tips, and you can get that at spjic.substack.com. Again, Toby, thank you very much for taking time to explain what your program is, and to, I think, give people some very important things to think about. Take care and be well.
Thank you.